Hi guys, thank you for clicking the link and viewing this video. As promised, today I'm going to be looking at the 13 UK Beatle releases, and I'm going to be ranking them from my least favourite to what I consider to be their very, very best. Now, that is, as we all know, a subjective subject. I've watched many videos, many reviews over the years whereby someone has done exactly the same and I've disagreed with them. Today, you're going to do exactly that. I guarantee you're going to disagree with where I've placed particular records. Okay, and if you do, please just give me a comment because I'd love to get into a discussion with you about it. First and foremost, it's one of my favourite things in the world. Let's discuss the Beatles. Let's have a conversation about them. There should be more of them. Right. For the purpose of this upload, I'm just going to state that I am using. I've got with me the 13 albums that were released in 2012. The remasters that were made by George Martin. I'm looking at the vinyls today. Now I actually own other copies, other variations of those same albums. However, what I don't want to do is kind of displace my opinion based upon newer releases. Now what we've had recently, as you I'm sure are all very aware, is we've had anniversary editions, we've had remixes, we've had further remasters, and sometimes what that does is that changes or alters your opinion on where the album should sit within your worst to best in this case. For example, Abbey Road just came out. Now I absolutely love Abbey Road, but if I was looking at the remix today, would I place it higher? Would I place it lower? It might change my opinion, so I'm not going to do that. There's no bias in that sense. I'm going to be looking at one set of albums. I'm going to be rating them on how I've always viewed them since I was a child. Okay? In at 13, I'm actually wearing the jumper. This will come as no surprise to any of you. Yellow Submarine. Okay? In fact, if you can find me someone who does not put this album at the very bottom of their list, I will be amazed. I will be amazed. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this record. In fact, I love it. I do love it. I love every single Beatle release. But this has to come bottom of the pile for me. And the reason being is that it's not really an album. Okay? The Beatles themselves had a very limited contribution. And the record itself was kind of just pushed out very quickly after the White Album. And in terms of it being a soundtrack as well, I mean, it's a really poor example of a soundtrack for a film. The B-side, if you don't already know, is made up entirely of George Martin instrumentals for the film. And they're all in fact very good, Pepperland being my favourite. However, the reason why, as a Beatles fan, are you going to listen to the B-side, for example, very often? Well, chances are no. In fact, I can think I've probably listened to it once since I've owned this copy of this record. As for the A-side, the A-side is made up of 6 tracks, 2 of which we've heard before. They were on other records. All You Need Is Love, Yellow Submarine, so Revolver, Magical Mystery Tour. And the other 4 tracks that you've got on here are kind of Beatle leftovers that weren't quite finished. There's a bit of an argument as to whether or not they were ever mixed properly in the first place. However, that is where things get slightly better. You've got 2 Harrison numbers on there, It's All Too Much and It's Only a Northern Song, which are very good, and to be fair, in my opinion, could have very easily gone on something, say, for example, like Sgt. Pepper. You've also got one of my favourite Lennon tracks on here, Hey Bulldog, which is a very underrated song from him. And then to finish it all off, you've got a wonderful piece of cheese by McCartney, All Together Now. Now, reserve judgment on that one. I'll let you tell me what you think of it, but it would be one of my least favourite McCartney tracks ever. Although, to be fair, a little bit of fun in the film. But there you have it. That's number 13. Good reason for it, but it's not really an album. If you're a bit of an obsessive fan like me, you've got to have a copy of this. But if you really want a songbook or soundtrack, if if you will, for the Yellow Submarine film. Then they released that in 1999 on vinyl, and that is actually, you know, a much better collection of songs in terms of I want to listen to Yellow Submarine. Okay, but number 13, moving on. Now this one's difficult. This one's very difficult for me because if it wasn't based on fact or on history, for example, this would be much, much higher up. However, it's not. Today it's not. Today, at number 12, is Magical Mystery Tour. Now, I love this record. Absolutely love this record. But this was never a Beatles album. The Beatles themselves, John, Paul, George and Ringo, did not set about making this 12-inch record. They didn't. In fact, at the time of its release, it was released as a double EP, whereby you got the first 6 tracks, the 6 tracks that actually appear in the film. Now, I'm actually lucky enough to own that, and that's wonderful. That is lovely. However, they did not produce this. This was actually a Capitol album. So it was released in America at the time, because, as I'm sure you're aware, Capitol released their own variations with little or no input from the Beatles, or the Beatles management. And this was one of the records they released for the film. And so they've got the first half on there, just as we got on the EP, but they've also got on the second, on the B-side, a number of tracks that, again, were kind of left over. So we've got a couple of singles on there. In the late 80s, what we did in this country is we adopted this record because we liked it so much, and it's actually now included in the main catalogue of Beatles albums. And this is the only Capitol record that we almost stole and took for ourselves. And I love it. Sometimes people say it's a bit of a mishmash when it comes to the second half. However, I disagree. The Beatles are still very much in their psychedelic phase at this point, and the songs that hang over do, I think, contribute and go very, very well with the first half. In fact, the album itself, in my opinion, flows very nicely. It's nice that you finally get on record, in an album sense anyway, a version of Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. Baby You're a Rich Man is a nice song, and again, There's All You Need Is Love, because apparently you can't have too much of that. The album, the book it comes with, is absolutely beautiful. If I was just basing this on Beatles albums I like, this would be much, much higher, but it was never intended to be part of their actual catalogue, so that's why it's in at number 12. Now, we're going to go with one of our earlier Beatles albums. And although I love this and I can listen to it, in fact, the majority, if not all, of these albums, you know, are wonderful in terms of being able to listen from the first track to the last track all the way through without ever needing to skip. That's one of the most beautiful things about the Beatles' catalogue of work. That's how consistent they were. And this is the same. This is a consistent album, but, you know, it's one of their weakest for me, and it is at number 11 with the Beatles. Now, despite the wonderful artwork, the record itself is made up of a number of tracks that, to be honest, just seem a little bit unfinished to me. A number of tracks that are covers, a number of tracks that, you know, they perhaps tried to give to other people, but ended up doing copies of them themselves. And it's really kind of, to me, the leftovers of Please Please Me. Now, there's nothing wrong with this album. I love it. I can listen to it all the way through. In fact, the first 2 tracks, to me, it's one of the best starts of an album that you could possibly imagine. So you've got It Won't Be Long, All I've Got to Do, and All My Loving. The first 3 is a great start to an album, but that for me is where it goes downhill a little bit. You get quite a few numbers that I think have dated a little bit now, and that's meant as no disrespect to the Beatles. Many of those were the covers that I was talking about earlier. And really, it just kind of, you know, it doesn't really go anywhere, this album. It's absolutely great, but it just kind of, you know, poodles along. And again is just made up of a number of tracks that I feel was very much left over from Please Please Me. Now, it's not new news. Most people know this, but you know, the Beatles themselves in the early days, in fact most people in the 60s or early 60s, didn't consider a record to be a piece of work in itself. It was solely a collection of songs, and to me, as George Martin quite rightly put, this is the best example of a collection of songs done by the Beatles. There's no fault whatsoever as to the order. It is literally just kind of a mishmash. But a good one nonetheless. But yeah, most bands in those days, they didn't really care. They didn't think of an album as a kind of piece of work in itself, and this is the kind of fruit of their labour at the time. Lovely record. I could listen to it 1,000 times and still be very, very happy, but that is exactly the reason why it falls in at number 11. Right, okay. Let It Be, number 10. This is a difficult one to review because I've thought long and hard about this for a long time. But this has to be number 10 for me, on the basis that the record itself, the band themselves weren't even happy with. They never finished it. They just left it for Phil Spector to produce, and it was eventually released after Abbey Road. And I think it's an absolute travesty that this was the final release from the Fab-Four. Not that it's a bad album, it's an absolutely wonderful album, but Abbey Road is just a piece of beauty, which kind of ended on a really high note. To me, that feels like the end of the band. Pardon the pun there. This, in that regards, kind of turns out to be a bit of a disappointment. Now, I actually really like this album. I do think it's absolutely wonderful. I thought about this long and hard recently. Every single song is almost an instant classic. There's not a bad song on it. However, it's the production that most people will kind of argue and say, you know, is the problem with it. Now, if this was Let It Be Naked, for example, Paul McCartney's 2003 version, I'd be again putting this much higher up in my list, because as a collection of songs, they're outstanding. However, this misses the mark for me completely. First off, you've got the two what are jam session tracks on there, completely unnecessary, not needed, could have just been put on an extra disc. So Dig a, I was about to say Dig a Pony, that's a great tune, not that one, Dig It, and I have to remind myself, Maggie May, Dig It and Maggie May weren't needed whatsoever. In fact, I know that this was supposed to be a kind of, you know, new phase Beatles record. Let's listen to them live, almost. Let's listen to them creating an album. But to me, it just all seems a little flat. And those two tracks in particular that I just mentioned really let down the quality of the whole piece. The songs themselves are great. Some people argue that, you know, the real reason why this isn't so good is because of Phil Spector's supposed wall of sound. Now, I don't really go for that, and the reason being that, yes, okay, he did overproduce some tracks, but he overproduced probably only 2 or 3. Let me just remind myself. Obviously, The Long and Winding Road comes up for discussion. Across the Universe, which I'll get onto in a minute, that is a gripe of mine. But really, that's about it. So 2 tracks there I can think of have that supposed wall of sound from Phil Spector, which everyone kind of almost can't stand. And it's that overproduced sound. We've got, you know, added orchestras, we've got vocals, etc. That are just added on, and the whole thing ends up kind of creating a track that sounds overtly compressed. And that's a shame. Going back to what I was saying, Across the Universe to me is one of John Lennon's best ever lyrics. In fact, it's an absolutely fabulous song. However, on here it's disappointing. You can barely hear his vocal, it's really pushed down into the mix, and there's just too much added crap on it. let's be fair, it's not bad. I will still listen to it, but if you want a good version of that, then listen to the one that's on Let It Be Naked, because it sounds like John Lennon and his guitar, and you really get a feel for how wonderful that song could have been or should have been. I know Paul McCartney argues the Long and Winding Road, for example. I quite like the version of the Long and Winding Road on here. I actually think that's an example of where Spector's kind of, added elements do help. But again, another very good variation on Let It Be Naked. I've never quite worked out which one I prefer. However, as a whole, this album just feels a little bit of a mess, and there's obviously the reason why the Beatles themselves decided not to bother finishing it. I just wish that they'd gone back to it a little bit later and decided to perhaps tidy it up, because they are great songs on here. Also, the fact that this misses Don't Let Me Down, I've never understood that, given the fact that it's actually in the film. I've never understood why it's not on this record. Obviously, I can only assume that Spector wasn't happy with the version or the recording that they had, or he had at his disposal at the time. But anyway, number 10, Let It Be. Now, this is going to upset some people. This is really going to upset some people, but I have to say that, I've been a fanatic for about 30 years, but I've never liked this album. It's grown on me since, I'll give you that. But in at number 9 for me is the White Album. Some people put this as number 1. They think it's a work of absolute art, genius, majesty, whatever you want to call it. For me, no. It is a wonderful record. But I used to hate it. I absolutely hated it. It was the one Beatles album I couldn't listen to when I was growing up. And it really took some work to kind of get over that. In recent years, as I've got a bit older, I've really come to appreciate this as a piece of work, and I do think it is a wonderful collection. I used to be one of those people that would go, well, you could make one good record out of this and get rid of the rubbish. However, kind of in hindsight and having thought about it, over the years, I think no, it should be like this. There should be 30 odd tracks. And it is different. Which in a way is kind of exciting. It completely takes you away from Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, that era. They do something entirely different here. It's almost going back to basics. However, for me, this is the indicator of when things started to go a little bit Pete Tong. What you've got on this album, really, in my opinion, is you've got 4 individuals plugging various tracks, and no one being able to actually have that conversation anymore as to kind of what's good and what's not. You've got a lot of gems on here. You've got a lot of wonderful, wonderful tracks. In fact, I love the first half. If I was rating this solely on the first record itself, the A and B side of that, this would be much higher. However, the second vinyl for me is where things really kind of go downhill a bit fast. Now again, there's some wonderful songs on that as well. But for me, it just doesn't do it. It doesn't flow, and it feels like a piece of work that wasn't finished. Again, another piece that wasn't finished, which is a shame. I recently listened to the Escher demos again. Absolutely lovely. But you could actually argue that some of these tracks aren't too far removed from the quality of that, which is a shame. Because I think this could have been so much better. It's clear to see, to me here, that George Martin was losing a little bit of his power within the recording studio, and the individuals within the band were starting to take over, and I feel it's a little bit disappointing. However, nonetheless, still a really, really good listen, and an album I enjoy a lot more than I used to. So, in at number 9, the White Album. Now, please don't get angry, because obviously I've shut that one down. Yeah, an album some people consider to be the very, very best of the Beatles, and I've dared to put this before it. I'm not going to apologise. I'm solely doing this on the basis of what I enjoy. Right. In at number 8 is Beatles for Sale. How on earth could I put this before the White Album? Well, for me, I love the early era of the Beatles. I love all eras of the Beatles, but in terms of consistency, their early work was really second to none. Now, a lot of people say this is the weakest of their earlier albums. Not quite for me. It's in a lovely gatefold sleeve for a start, which was the first one that we got with the Beatles. And not only that, I think the A-side in particular of this album is extremely good. Now, when you take into consideration the fact that at this point in time they were knackered, look at the picture of them. They were knackered. So, having had an album that, having had an album prior to this, in A Hard Day's Night, whereby all of the tracks were written by them, or written by Lennon, McCartney, or Harrison, we kind of go backwards a little bit with this album. We've got quite a few covers in there again, and that's because they didn't have time. They didn't have a lot of time in the recording studio, so this almost was a little bit rushed out, admittedly by them. However, I think it's a good collection of songs. Some people have argued that, you know, it's almost a bit depressing. It's a bit of a depressing downer, so to speak, in comparison to their first three records. I can see that. I can see the point that people are making. However, it's a good downer. Babies in Black, No Reply, I'm a Loser, 8 Days a Week, all on this album. Absolutely wonderful. And for me, you know, it's nice. I like the story behind this record. I like the fact that they were kind of openly struggling at that time, and all of a sudden I think the writing starts to take on a little bit of that. So to me, this is the record whereby you first see a kind of lyrical development within the group. So in at number 8 is Beatles for Sale. Right, the album that came out just after it was Help. The last of their kind of, you know, Beatle Bob albums, if you will, fab-four style albums, quite standard, quite typical for the first 5 that came out. The second of their films, Help, great album, in at number 7, and I love this record. Now, there are a couple of like, you know, not too good tracks on here. There's a couple of weak numbers. However, it's brought up by the ones that are really, really strong. And not only do you have the title track on there, you've got Ticket to Ride, you've got To Hide Your Love Away, You're Gonna Lose That Girl, Yesterday. You've got some absolute corkers on this record. Couple of duff numbers like I mentioned, but otherwise a really, really, really strong album. And considering again, like I mentioned earlier, this was shortly after Beatles for Sale. They were still you know, overworking at this point. This is a really good album and a really excellent follow-up to that. And the last one of an era, in my mind. So yeah, in at number 7, Help. In at number 6, Please Please Me. Out of all their early work, to me, this is the best album. This is an absolutely phenomenal first album. In fact, probably the best first album by a band ever, in my opinion. It is just great. And in many ways, actually, this album has aged more than any of the others in terms of its sound quality, in terms of the tracks, in terms of the compositions. But in a weird way, that's how it kind of keeps its charm, how it maintains its charm. It's absolutely wonderful. In comparison to with the Beatles, the tracks they're doing on this record, I like the highlights of what they used to do in the Cavern Club when they used to tour. These are their best songs. We all know the history of the record itself was actually made over the course of 9 hours. Obviously, Take Away, Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You, that was done at a different time, but the rest of the record was done in a day, and that is just unheard of. You wouldn't be thinking that today. You know, some people take 2 to 3 years to make an album. These guys did it in 9 hours, and when you really take that into consideration, this is a truly wonderful piece of work. So yeah, Please Please Me in at number 6. I don't really have any negative to say. There's not a bad track on this. You'll listen to it quite happily all the way through. And this is like the Beatles have arrived. One thing I will note here though, I did want to include in this review a little bit about the Decca tapes. I wanted to almost include them in the catalogue. Now they're worth a listen if you haven't heard them. The album of tracks that they kind of roughly recorded at their Decca edition before they obviously were signed to Parlophone, EMI in this case. And there's a number of tracks on there that you might not have heard, which are absolutely wonderful. And I always felt it was a shame that they didn't redo that album or remix it or whatever, or do it or themselves, the band that is. I've actually got a version of itself on vinyl, but really it is just a straight recording from the demos they did. But there's a couple of numbers on there which could have very easily fitted on this record, but that's a tale for another day. In at number 6, Please Please Me. Right, in at number 5. Again, another one that's really going to upset people, but it is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, again, a bit like the White Album, maybe this says something a little bit about coming of age, because a bit like the White Album, this record for me, I didn't like when I was growing up. I didn't mind it, but I used to skip a lot of the tracks, whereas now I can listen to it from the first track to the last track, and I will love it. I really, really enjoy it these days. However, growing up, I didn't so much, and I think that says a lot maybe about me and a lot about kind of, you know, what we prefer when we're younger. Maybe I was just not old enough to appreciate this record, in the same sense that I wasn't old enough to appreciate the White Album. And the reason being that, you know, I think when you're young, you know, the Beatles in the suits, the mop tops, etc., the Beatle boots, is really appealing, and this is a little bit too kind of far out from that by the time that you reach this record. So maybe it was just a shock to the system, and perhaps I didn't give this the time that it deserved. However, this is a great record. Most people call this their best, and some people in fact argue that this is the greatest record of all time. However, I'm going to disagree. The reason why it's my number 5 is that because it doesn't have Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, I actually feel that a number of the songs are a little weak, filler tracks, so to speak. Now, the album starts off with aplomb. The first couple of numbers up until Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds are absolutely brilliant, but after that it just gets a little bit kind of filler for me. And I know George Martin later regretted that he never put the 2 singles out on the record. I think he felt rushed at the time to release a single, because there hadn't been a Beatles single for some considerable time. But then this is what you got. The record is brilliant, but again, there's a big middle section there, maybe too much McCartney. Now, McCartney's not my favourite Beatle. I do love him, but for me, this is where things start to get a little cheesy in places. And also, I don't buy this idea that it was all perfectly conceptual. There are things about this that were, and there are things that really, really work. However, one of the biggest disappointments for me is that, again, I'm going to use that word, unfinished. They started this album wanting to go from song to song, flowing much in the same way that you get with the medley on Abbey Road. But they gave up after 2 tracks. They gave up after 2 tracks and could be bothered. Or it got too hard or whatever, or it got too time consuming, I'm not too sure. And I think that's one of the things that lets the record down. However, I can see why people say this is their greatest piece of work. You've got A Day in the Life on there, which is absolutely, it's just a work of art. You've got She's Leaving Home, one of McCartney's best, if you ask me. And you've got some terrific individual numbers on this album. But for me, in places, there are numbers that, you know, I think could have been missed out. You could have had a couple of the Harrison numbers that I mentioned earlier on here instead. And again, you could have put the singles on there, which I think would have made this a little bit better. But I know the Beatles didn't like releasing singles. They like to give you value for money. They do that here, as they always do. However, I feel that they were really made for this album, those 2 tracks. And that's why, for me, it's down At number 5, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In at number 4, Revolver. Again, absolutely wonderful album. Great. Some lovely songs on there, and this is in their period where they had their 3 best records, really. Let me not, regardless of what you think about where I've ranked the albums themselves, there's no disputing that Rubber Soul, Revolver and Sgt. Pepper were their most commercially successful period. Well, actually, no, not their most commercially successful period, but certainly the period of or era of the Beatles that people look back on now and go, right, those 3 albums, yeah, nothing wrong with them. They're absolutely perfect. Nearly lost my voice there. Yeah, I've actually not got a lot to say about this record. It's absolutely brilliant. Please listen to it. Yeah, Revolver. Wonderful. In at number 3. Now, I've sped things up a little bit here because, unless I got some history, unless I got some facts about an album, I'm not going to say an awful lot. Please excuse the EP that's with this one. Hard Day's Night is in at number 3 for me. Apologies for the Long Tall Sally EP there. That's the single that was released at the time. Do get that if you can. It's brilliant. And the 4 tracks that are on that would easily fit on this. For me, the reason why this has to come up so high, it's always been one of my favourite Beatles records. It's the best of their early work, if you ask me. The album is made up entirely of Lennon and McCartney tracks. In fact, I have to check that. Yeah. It is made up entirely of Lennon and McCartney tracks. I think I said Harrison earlier, but no. The Harrison number on here is John and Paul's as well. And as a huge John Lennon fan, 10 of the tracks are actually sung by him, so you could argue that those 10 tracks were all written by him. So for me, this is John's band, this is John's album. In a nutshell here, this is kind of Beatlemania at its best. This is the record for me that goes, that just shouts out, screams out Beatlemania. Not a bad track on it, coming in at only half an hour in length, perhaps even less. You could listen to this again and again and again. It's an absolutely wonderful album, and a much better soundtrack to the film. In a way that perhaps the Yellow Submarine soundtrack should have been, but that's again a question for another day. But in at number 3, A Hard Day's Night. Now we're getting to the nitty gritty. This is the exciting bit. If you've been watching, you'll realise that there's only 2 albums left. You'll know which 2 albums they are, and I'm sure you're screaming at me in terms of kind of what should be number 1 out of these 2. So I'll speed things up. In at number 2, Abbey Road. Abbey Road has always been one of my favourite records. To me, out of all the late stuff, this is the Beatles at their best. You can see they're working in harmony. The B-side, as I discussed in an earlier review, is just a work of art, and every single track is a classic on here. I don't care what people say about Maxwell's Silver Hammer. I don't care what people say about Octopus's Garden. I think they're brilliant tracks, and they do work within the running order of this album. Really, this is their swan song. This is the last album they recorded, and you can tell it is just absolutely beautiful. And it was very difficult for me not to put this at number 1. This was one of the late records, one of their later pieces that even as a very young child I got on with straight away. Loved it from the moment I heard it, which is a bit more difficult for me to say when it comes to the majority of the last 5-6 records, but this is one I took to straight away. So this is number 2, Abbey Road, and that only leaves one. Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul will always be my favourite Beatles record. This is where things started to take quite a drastic change. In terms of direction, the direction of the group, in terms of the direction of the music. However, one of the reasons why I put this above Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, is that you still have a bit of Beatlemania, you still have the Beatle Bobs, you still have that vibe about the group in this record. Yeah, you've got a number of tracks here that you could have easily taken from a number of the albums that preceded it. But you've also got a number of tracks that were cutting edge at the time. And there's just a nice mix between all of them. It's quite clear that they're going in a different musical direction by the time you reach this album. However, it still feels kind of true to what they were before. So it just sits, it falls nicely in the middle for me. It's got my very favourite John Lennon track on there, Nowhere Man Anyway, In My Life, are absolutely beautiful. It starts with the wonderful Drive My Car. Norwegian Wood is a great example of George Harrison using his kind of Indian kind of influence by that time, but in still a very commercial, contemporary way at this point. And everything just works for me. I listen to this record, I mean, you could put this together with Revolver, they could be one album, but I listen to this record and I hear a band who are happy to be in the studio, really happy to experimenting with new things, whilst at the same time still adhering and still being true to the group they were before. So number one for me will always be Rubber Soul. However, one little extra disclaimer I will add: if you want to listen to a really truly terrific version of this album, don't listen to this one. This is the stereo. Get it in mono, okay? It is just like making love to your ears, okay? But anyway, in at number one is Rubber Soul. Alright, so that's it. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please feel free to like, comment, or even better, subscribe, and let me know. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think should have been number 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. Yeah? I don't mind. If you disagree, please leave some feedback and we can have a little chat about it, because that is what we do. Okay? See you next time.